Well, good afternoon. I'm going to welcome you to the final Kessler Conversation of the fall 2022 semester. My name is Bo Adams, and I serve as director of Pitt's Theology Library here at Emory University. And if you're a regular guest of our Kessler Conversations, this setup might look a little different to you because today's a pretty special conversation. All fall, we've been talking about Martin Luther's September Testament, that first edition of Luther's translation of the New Testament from Greek into German. And all of that has been centered around a beautiful exhibition that we are housing here in our gallery. And I'm privileged today to be joined by the curator of that exhibition here in the gallery, my colleague, Dr. Armin Sedlecki. Dr. Sedlecki, for the last 2 decades, has had more responsibility for the Kessler collection than anyone. I guarantee you, if you have ever read, seen, or visited any of our Kessler events, you have certainly benefited from his scholarship. In addition to exhibition curation like this, Dr. Sedlecki has cataloged the collection and has been involved in publication and translation projects from the works within the collection. So, Dr. Sedlecki, we're very excited to have you here. Thank you for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you very much for inviting me. This is quite an honor. Thank
you. It's fun to be amongst the books that you've done such a brilliant job of curating. So I look forward to talking a little about it. So let's just start to talk about the exhibition. So in many ways, it's an exhibition focused on one book, but you've used about 60 books to tell the story. And yet you've had to choose those 60 books from the 155,000 books that are here in the Rare Book Collection of the library. So can you talk to us a little bit about the art of curation and how you approach this particular project?
Sure. Well, you start with a book, obviously. If there's a thematic focus, then you have a number of books. But and then I want to explain the context, the historical context, but also the impact. So it's where it came from and where it's going, or what came after it. Now, these lines of connection between the item, its context, and its impact really grow into a very interesting and complex web of interrelations, and really yield what goes into the exhibit after that. I don't necessarily always know what I'm going to put into an exhibit when I start curating, but I follow those lines that emerge as they emerge, and it's almost an organic thing. I'm telling a story, and I want the story to be relevant, to be interesting. It's not just old books, but it's a story of why these old books are still important today, and it should be a coherent story, ideally. In a way, I take some inspiration from Luther, who wanted to make the biblical text, which was quite old, relevant for his time. And well, that's the same hermeneutical spirit, I think, is behind what I try to do in an exhibit, which is to make our old texts relevant for today.
Well, it's so fascinating. I mean, I think you've definitely told a story. And what's interesting to me is you've told a story to multiple generations, right? I mean, we've had scholars in here in the exhibition. We've had children here in the exhibition. And in many ways, there are multiple touch points that I think all of those audiences can reach to. So I want to talk a little bit about what you just described in terms of the approach to the exhibition. You highlight the context for what Luther's doing. So the September Testament, published in 1522, kind of at the height of the growing Reformation, and in many ways, the biblical text itself is a part of Luther's theological project. But this is happening in a world and in a context. So when we think about Luther, not just translating the Bible, but really doing something new with the Bible, what did the Bible look like at the time? I mean, you've given us lots of examples of Latin Vulgates, of earlier German translations. So what was the Bible that Luther kind of went to and translated from?
Well, he translated from Erasmus's Greek New Testament. The Vulgate was the undisputed text of the church.
Yeah.
It was used in citations, debates, philosophical discussions. Luther wanted to go behind that. It is said that he was inspired to learn Greek by Erasmus's first edition of the printed New Testament, which was printed in 1516, and he used the second edition that came out in 1519 to translate from. That was his Vorlage, as the German scholars would say. There was actually an earlier printed version of the Greek New Testament, the Complutensian Polyglot. It was printed in 1514, but Erasmus had managed to get a monopoly on printing the Greek text of the New Testament, and so it wasn't allowed to be sold until really the early 1520s, by which time Erasmus already had more than had 2 editions out, and
You got it out
cornered
first.
the
Yeah.
market. Yeah, it's a good story.
Yeah.
It's interesting also about the Complutensian polyglot. When it came out, it had for the Old Testament the text of the Vulgate in the middle, the Hebrew text on the left, and the Greek text on the right. And a lot of people responded by saying, well, this is like Christ hanging between the 2 thieves, which shows you how much people gave priority to the Vulgate, to the Latin text, even over the original languages.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, Luther's not only taking the Bible and putting it into vernacular, which had been done before, but he's really going back to the original sources and starting with the Greek. By the way, it's so exciting that you mentioned all of these books, and all of them are just behind us here in the gallery that people can come and experience this. So as you present our particular copy of the September Testament, we're incredibly blessed to have this rare book, this super important book. But all of the books from this particular period are unique in some particular way. Even though thousands of copies may have been made, maybe dozens exist, each one is unique. And you've highlighted in the exhibition why the Kessler Collection's particular copy is unique. And you've done so by flanking the September Testament itself in the central case with 2 cases, one focused on Lucas Cranach and other on Johannes Tauler. So can you talk a little bit about the decision to highlight these 2 figures and why they are so important in telling this story?
Sure. Well, Cranach was the publisher of the September Testament. Melchior Lotte, the younger, was the printer, but he worked on Cranach's printing press and on his premises. He was the publisher. And he was directly involved in redacting the text and in the layout and everything. Cranach, of course, is one of the major artists of the Northern Renaissance, usually named together with Albrecht Dürer or Hans Holbein, and really quite a fascinating person. He was the court painter to the Elector Frederick, Luther's first sponsor, so to speak. Lived in Wittenberg and was also a close personal friend of Martin Luther's. In fact, he was the godfather to Luther's oldest son. And this makes him very relevant to the September Testament. In addition to being the publisher, he contributed 21 full-page woodcuts to the Book of Revelation. Curiously enough, that's the only one that has full-page woodcuts, but I mean, Revelation must be an artist's dream.
A lot of images to depict there. Yeah.
His images are based on Albrecht Dürer's Apocalypse, or 2 apocalypses. He's got a large apocalypse and a small apocalypse. So the imagery, he used some of the imagery, but really gave it his own style, his own personality. There are a number of noteworthy images, but there's one I think that's particularly interesting, and it's the whore of Babylon riding the beast in Revelation chapter 17. She is portrayed as having a triple crown or tiara, and that would have been immediately recognized as a symbol of the papacy.
Yeah.
The triple crown, anything issued by the Pope had the papal seal, which included this triple crown, and it would have been immediately recognized. And that was actually a politically very dangerous and incendiary statement to make. Because basically what he is saying is that the Pope is like the whore of Babylon riding the beast. And in fact, so much so that when the second edition of Luther's translation was published in December 1522, the December Testament, which is actually right behind you, the image was altered and the crown was reduced to a single crown. It came back eventually after the Reformation established itself, but
Well, it's amazing, imagery is so powerful and is used so effectively by Luther at this particular period. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Luther is in hiding. He's removed from Wittenberg when this project is happening, right? So it's Cranach kind of his person on the ground who's getting the work done?
He certainly acted as a go-between. He also did a drawing of Luther as Junker Jörg, which was the name he assumed while he was in hiding at the Waldburg. And it's a very unusual image of Luther. He's got a beard and not the typical image of Luther that we know, which is usually the academic Dr. Luther. And so, yeah, he saw him certainly, and yeah.
Well, so we've got Cranach on one side, Cranach, who's
yeah.
the publisher who's putting this book together. And then on the other side of the September Testament here in the gallery, you have a case devoted to Johannes Tauler, who's an earlier figure. So what is the connection between Tauler and Luther?
Well, there's no direct connection except in our specific copy. The Kessler collection copy of the September Testament is bound with a collection of sermons by Johannes Tauler. This sort of practice was not unusual to bind titles together. It was sometimes done for practical reasons, but sometimes also for thematic reasons. And I think the person, we don't know who did it, who put these two books together and gave them one single binding. The binding is from the 17th century. So it must have been somebody, at least by that time, the two books were associated with each other.
Yeah.
Tauler was a 13th century Dominican preacher, very popular preacher of his time, and a mystic. He belonged to the circle of Meister Eckhart, and there were a lot of connecting points between his theology and Luther's theology. Humility, self-denial, and the idea that you find God through trials, tribulations. If you listen to the Mighty Fortress is Our God, the battle hymn of the Reformation, a lot of the language is very would very much resonate with the theology that you find in Tauler's sermons. Also, one of Tauler's students published a book called a German Theology, wrote a book, I should say. It was published for the first time at Luther's initiative in 1518. We've also included that in our exhibit. And Luther said of this book that he has not learned as much from any other book except the Bible and the writings of St. Augustine.
Wow.
So there's definitely an impact of theology.
So we know of a historical connection, at least a literary connection between Luther and Tauler. And I love that the September Testament here, the Kessler collection, is itself a physical manifestation of that connection, right? Someone in the 17th century thought we should put these together because they belong together. When I talk to friends and colleagues about this exhibition, you know, they often say, I recognize Luther as an important historical figure, so it makes sense that you would have an exhibition. But I don't think they oftentimes get the impression of how important Luther is for particular communities. So you grew up in Germany, you're a Lutheran here in America. Can you talk a little bit about the standing of Luther, both as a historical and a kind of cultural and national figure, and what role he plays in a contemporary church that is founded with his name?
Well, Protestants don't have the veneration of the saints as you would have in the Catholic Church, although Luther comes pretty close, I think, in the Lutheran Church. In Germany, Luther is really sort of a folk hero. And in the 19th century, he was seen as a great German nationalist who stood up to the Italians, the Pope in Rome, unified Germany through his translation. And this was something that, of course, the Nazis picked up in the Third Reich. I mean, he sadly, they also picked up on his anti-Semitic writings, which are horrible, inexcusable. But interestingly enough, in East Germany, communist East Germany, and Luther's homeland, Thuringia, Saxony, is in the former East Germany. The East German government liked Luther because they portrayed him as a hero of the working class, making the Bible accessible for the common people. He stood up for the common people. And it's really quite fascinating. So, I mean, he's been co-opted a lot. But he really has a very strong standing. And I think folk hero is a good way to describe him in Germany. And his translation really endures. In fact, it's still used in a slightly modified form, but this modification is really just focused on corrections, and it's in the spirit of Luther's translation itself. He never saw the text as static. In fact, it's the exact opposite. A text should be living, should be organic, so to speak, should be adapted to the language of the people. And the Lutheran Church in Germany has done this and has kept up to date, being, again, true to Luther's Bible, but also incorporating things that emerged from historical critical scholarship in biblical studies, or adapting the language. Some words dropped out of use, using more modern language, but it's very much in the spirit of Luther. And,
But it is true. I mean, it's
Yeah.
the Luther Bible that Germans are reading today.
Yes.
Yeah.
and in fact, even Catholics often read the Luther Bible.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Which is, there is a Catholic translation, but that came out for liturgical use after Vatican II, and that was issued in consultation with Lutheran theologians and biblical scholars.
Oh, interesting.
I think is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you talked about the impact. One of the things that the exhibition does so effectively, I think, is not simply highlight this translation that happened 500 years ago, but talk about this as the kind of beginning of vernacular translations in Europe, and then spilling over, of course, here into America. As you say in the subtitle of the exhibition, that it really is about 500 years of vernacular scripture. So what role can we ascribe to Luther in kind of getting the ball rolling, if you will, and how do you kind of tell the story of vernacular translations through the rest of the gallery?
Well, vernacular to Luther wasn't just using German words. That was not enough. It was speaking in the language of the people that the people could understand. The idea that the text really should speak to the hearts of the people was quite important to him. Ironically, the Vulgate itself was a vernacular translation.
Vulgar, Vulgate,
common style. And Jerome tried to make the Greek and Hebrew text accessible to his 4th century Latin speakers. And it uses a very common Latin, not the rhetorical Latin of Cicero, but a plain style. But it sort of became frozen in time. And by Luther's time, nobody spoke like that anymore. The Church Latin was different, and Cicero was being rediscovered or appreciated again. So the style of the Vulgate really had become frozen in time. Plus, a lot of people didn't know Latin. There were, as you mentioned before, there were German translations before, but they were really very wooden and very literal. I always think of it like Google Translate. I'm very glad that Google Translate exists. I use it to make sense of texts where I don't speak the language, but imagine reading the Bible via Google Translate. That's sort of what you get with these other German translations who were based on the Vulgate, not the Greek text, and are very literal. Friedrich Nietzsche, sort of an unusual person to comment on Luther, but he said that Luther's Bible is the greatest achievement among German books.
Wow.
Compared to it, all other books are, they do not speak to the hearts of the people the way Luther's Bible does. And I think it's interesting that he uses that language, speak to the heart of the German people.
And so would you say that this idea, kind of carrying on Luther's mission, his method, or this kind of true sense of the vernacular continues? Because very quickly, as you highlight in the gallery, we get many other European language translations coming. And so I assume there are other figures who are taking their cue from Luther, but who are kind of the Luther, if you will, of the French Bible, the Italian Bible. And you've done such a great job. And I imagine it was challenging to select just a few, because you could tell the story of every translation that's happened in Europe from the time. So is it possible, I guess, to tie all of those translations in many ways back to what Luther is doing? And in many ways, people are taking their cue from him?
I think so. I think the spirit behind these translations was definitely influenced or prompted by Luther's translation. I try to include older versions or earlier, if possible, first editions of translations. We've got a first edition of the first modern Arabic translation from the original languages. Of course, there are Arabic manuscripts much, much older, but the first modern translation based on the original languages is included, or the first complete Bible in Chinese translated. I also try to include a lot of English Bibles. I mean, that's
Mhm.
something that visitors to the exhibition can connect with. I'm aware that most people do not speak 16th century Latin or German. And I've included Tyndale, for example.
Yeah.
Tyndale, and we were lucky that we were able to include Tyndale because we know a local collector, Michael Morgan, lives in Atlanta.
Mhm.
And it's one of the really greatest collectors of English Bibles in North America, I think. He's got an amazing collection, including a first edition King James, which he lent us for this exhibit, and 2 beautiful copies of Tyndale's Bible, which are on exhibit here as well. Tyndale knew Luther. He was really quite influenced by what was happening in Germany, and he went to Germany and enrolled in Wittenberg, studied in Wittenberg for a while, and probably began translating the Bible into English at the time. He translated the entire New Testament and portions of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And he was directly inspired by Luther, but I think that spirit of making the text accessible really goes back to Luther.
Well, and you mentioned the King James. I think for many people like me, that becomes the touch point, right? You understand the King James, but you may not understand that the King James is almost a century after Luther's work. And of course, has a connection to Tyndale as well. So how do we trace the connection from Luther to the King James that may be so familiar to us English Bible readers?
Well, the reason why Tyndale never became an official version was political, which the whole story I think is quite fascinating. Tyndale went into exile to Europe, left England because he was considered a heretic. Cardinal Wolsey.
For the act of translating or for many other things?
For many other things as well. But once he got going with the translation, that was definitely part of it.
Yeah.
And he did not return to England. Henry VIII had just recently written a tract against Luther, or had put his name to that tract.
Yep.
Against Luther, defending the 7 sacraments, and was named Defender of the Faith by the Pope at the time. And so he was very much defending the Catholic Church, and of course that meant not including Tyndale. When Henry broke with the Catholic Church because he wanted to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and Mary Anne Boleyn, he was not given permission to remarry. So he essentially founded his own church, Church of England. Now you would think that Tyndale would be allowed to come back then, but Tyndale was not willing to condone this marriage either. So Henry left him in England, and he was eventually captured by imperial troops who burned him at the stake for being a heretic. But his translation, especially of the New Testament, had a huge impact on following translations and was used as really a go-to point for other people who used the original text, such as the King James translators. But Tyndale was always sort of what they matched it against. Is that,
So and you tell the story so well. As you mentioned, you have several cases of English Bibles, and it does seem that as you get different monarchs coming into England, new translations arise. And of course, you have the Geneva Bible, where you've got the Protestants run out of England, and then they bring back their own translation. And it does seem you have a kind of cacophony of English translations, which I suspect leads King James to do what King James did and commission his own translation. So while we're talking about language, I've heard, you've mentioned before that Luther is not just going to German, he's going to go to the German of the people and the language that people would speak. Can you comment a little bit about Luther's German? I mean, it's often said that he's kind of a master of language himself. What is Luther's German like? And how does that, as you said earlier, differ from other Bibles that had appeared before? And what role does his use of the kind of common German language play in the popularity of his Bible and his movement?
Well, Luther spoke the language of Saxony and Thuringia, which is sort of central Germany, central Eastern And it was a language, it wasn't the Low German of the North, it wasn't the Swiss German, which has its own peculiarities, but it was sort of a compromised German. It was in the middle. It could be understood by people in the North, could be understood by people in the South. And even when the first Luther Bible outside of Wittenberg was published in Basel, in Switzerland, the printer, Adam Petri, used Luther's language, some spelling adaptations, and he had a glossary, but he used Luther's translation. And it could be understood north and south. And once you have a fundamental text like the Bible, spreading all over Germany in that language itself becomes normative. And so it really did a lot to unify the language.
I guess in a similar, I mean, the King James Bible plays a similar role, right, in the formation of an English language. So Luther, again, is not only a hero in terms of his Bible, but also as a kind of cultural touch point for the formation of, or the beginning of a formation, so say, of a modern German language.
And yeah, there are some words that he invented to translate, much as you would find in King James as well, that become part and parcel of the modern language, German or English for King James. And
literally inventing to try to capture the sense of what's going on in the text. I mean, one thing we focused on, and I love, this is going back a little bit, but you had to make a decision about which page of the September Testament to open to. Sadly, you can't open to all of the pages, though you've done a good job of reproducing some of them. So can you tell us the text you chose? Because I think it's significant in terms of the specific language choices that Luther makes in translating that particular verse.
It's Romans 3, and the passage where it says, we are saved by faith or faith alone. And that verse was one of the probably most controversial. Because it's so fundamental to Luther's theology, saved by faith alone. You're not saved by good works. But Catholic theologians, of course, would dispute that. They said, well, there's no word in the Greek original that means alone by itself. And Luther argues in his tract on translating that it is absolutely necessary within the German idiom to put alone in, because it really makes no sense without it. It's implied, so to speak. Even if the word is not there, it is there if you try to put it into the spoken German language.
Well, I mean, you mentioned that tract. I think so. The Bible's coming out in 1522. It's not until 1530 that he writes this wonderful tract where he defends, in some sense, his translation. So I want to move in a very different direction, because I think one of the most interesting things you did in the exhibit is you focus on what you kind of call modern adaptations or modern translations of the Bible. And I think visitors to the exhibition might be surprised by some of the things about it. I mean, you walk through a gallery of 400- or 500-year-old books, and all of a sudden you're confronted with, for example, the Brick Bible, Brendan Powell Smith's 2013 retelling of the biblical text through Lego figures, quite literally staging the scenes. And it's a fascinating book. It's interesting, it's entertaining, but I think you're making a point that it does belong alongside these. So how do you put a 500-year-old Luther translation alongside the Brick Bible? How do those two things go together?
It is interesting. And when we have younger people come in here, school classes, for example, that's the case that draws most of us. Oh, the Brick Bible. Well, I mean, there's a curiosity and entertainment factor, as you said, but if you look at these recreations of biblical scenes and biblical texts with Lego figurines, it's actually quite true to the text. Sometimes quite literal and almost jarring. It's like, oh, wow. But it makes a hermeneutical move. It adapts the language. So in a way, it's its own vernacular. It translates the Bible into Lego, if you want. Now, it's a vernacular translation, not at the level of King James or September Testament, of course, but at the level that reaches its readers, children from 9 to 99, I think is what Lego does. So I love Legos and I love the Brick Bible. It's quite...
Well, it is amazing. I mean, it's just amazing. The very fact of the creation is amazing. But I think you're right that it does, in some sense, highlight what is happening in any translation, right? That you are taking one idea and putting it in a completely different vernacular. And it's one of the reasons why we have a plethora of English translations, right? Is that they're all, it's not that one is better than the other, but it's that one has to make certain decisions or philosophical choices about how to do translation. And who's to say that moving into Lego figurines is not as defensible as moving into a particular form of the English language? So I hope people get a sense as we talk about it, how complex the art or science, and I'd be interested whether it's an art or science in your mind, of curation is. And I think increasingly in museum studies and in library studies, people start to appreciate what you see here in this gallery is scholarship in the same way that writing a monograph or writing a journal article is. And I've certainly had the privilege of probably far too often watching you curate so many exhibitions. It's really astounding. I was hoping you might reflect a little bit on curation as an act of scholarship, because you've certainly been involved in the more traditional forms of scholarship, translations, articles, monographs, those kinds of things. But is it the same scholarly activity for you? And how do you feel in the act of curation as a scholar? How do those things fit together?
Mhm. Well, it's not quite the same act of scholarship, but I think it definitely is an act of scholarship. For one thing, a lot of research goes into it.
Yeah.
You have to engage the literature that is out there, and rely on people who have written about this, who have written about the background. I always learn a lot when I do an exhibition. There's a lot of creative thought, I think, that goes into it. You ask whether it's a science or an art. It's a bit of both, I think.
Yeah.
There's analytical thought, creative thought that goes into it. And for our exhibitions in particular, I think it's a group project. I think that really needs to be emphasized as well. This is not just me putting these together in my genius mind, but I'm very fortunate to be in a community of scholars here with whom I can talk, exchange ideas, who get involved in really anything from making things available, pulling items, to installing them physically, to giving me new ideas. It's quite interesting. Now, with an exhibition, I can do something that cannot be done in articles, and that is to show the actual physical piece. And I think that's really quite an advantage, and something that exhibitions can do that scholarship itself cannot. I was fortunate to go through the exhibition with Timothy Wengert last week, who, of course, is one of the foremost Luther scholars. And we were talking about Luther's tract on translating. And he said, well, it's interesting, and people really haven't explored this enough, but Luther responds almost point by point to Johannes Emser's annotations to Luther's Testament. Johannes Emser was a Catholic theologian who published his own German translation of the Bible, and who also issued a publication, or was issued posthumously actually, of Luther's translation with really point-by-point annotations of why this is wrong. And Luther responds almost point by point to these accusations, to these annotations. They were published posthumously in 1530, and Luther's tract on translating comes out in 1530. And I did not know about the nuances of these relationships, but Timothy Wengert did, and said, this really needs to be explored much. And I was happy to see that I put those actually right next to each other almost by chance.
Without even knowing,
this is one of those organic connections that emerges.
No, I think it's fascinating. And I think there's so much going on here. When you see the physical items, you see the items next to each other, you're able to kind of make those connections. So naturally, I want to pivot to talk about this kind of work in a digital age. Of course, our exhibitions have digital components. Of course, we digitize a lot of these books. But there's something about walking around this space, and I'm just kind of looking and taking it in and seeing these physical items. And not to be, too Pollyannish about it, but like holding a book and imagining someone else held this, or many people have held this over the centuries, or Luther himself held this, or something like that. You and I are obviously biased and think the work of this is important. But what changes in the digital age? Why continue to do this work when we have computers and screens and digitization? How does it look in the digital age going forward?
Well, I think it's important to hang on to the physical copies
Mhm.
as well. It's a very different experience. Um, Reading the content of a book is one thing, and is of course important, and we need to have digitizations and online text availability. But seeing the book when it was produced, the feel of the paper, the binding, the dimensions. I mean, there's a Latin Vulgate, a Glossa Ordinaria on display in this exhibition that is just huge.
Yeah.
And even if you know the dimensions, it's a very different experience to actually see it.
Pick it up. Yeah. It's
Right,
heavy.
pick
Yeah.
it up, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about, because next to that book, you have that 1491 Vulgate that's tiny.
Right.
And in many ways, if you could look at a screenshot of it and zoom in to read the text. But the point of seeing that book is you actually couldn't read this. And you imagine people didn't have glasses like we do. They didn't have electric lights like we do. And so I suspect having a book that contains all of Scripture, even if you can't read it, says something about what reading meant for a community like that, that it was important to hold God's word as opposed to simply consume the words that are on the page. And to your point, you can't make that point if you don't have it sitting alongside another Vulgate that is massive in scale and has clearly legible type. So yeah, I do think that the physical is connected to this. And I presume in your own research, having digital copies of things that we aren't privileged to own is helpful in your work. But it's no substitute, I hope, because we were to keep doing this. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think we have an obligation to collect and to preserve these books.
Yeah.
Obviously, not every library can do this, but we're fortunate enough to have such a collection, and it's a great responsibility to preserve it, hopefully for many, many more centuries.
Yeah.
But not just to preserve it, but also to make it accessible.
Yeah.
Because reading the physical book is such an experience. It's so different from reading an online digitized version. And to make sure that future generations can have that experience.
Yeah. Well, and I think when we talk about accessibility, it's not simply photographing or scanning the pages. It's the metadata. It's partnering with other institutions. I mean, you've talked about your work with VD16, which is a database of 16th century printed books, but we're for libraries to collaborate together to say, where are these books and how can we share information to make sure that people have the full knowledge? And then, of course, the curation piece. It's one thing to look at a 16th century German book that I can't read. It's another thing to have item labels and descriptions and have it alongside other things that provide the context and help you understand what it is that you're looking at. So yeah, I think the work of an exhibition like this with its digital components is even more important as we're kind of overwhelmed with the amount of information that's out there. So I want to kind of turn and invite folks to learn more. Our exhibition is available. There's online content, there's a print exhibition catalog, these kinds of things. When you talk to people who want to learn more, whether it's about Luther or about the Bible or about translation, are there sources, are there authors, are there places that you send them where they might read a little bit more or learn a little bit more?
Yeah. Well, I think the two scholars who were interviewed for this exhibit, I think are a very good starting point. Another very good starting point is Timothy Wengert's book, Reading the Bible with Martin Luther. I knew you were going to ask me that, so
you brought notes.
I brought some notes. Yeah. William Marsh, Martin Luther on Reading the Bible as Christian Scripture. 2017 publication. I think it's quite good. John Flood's Martin Luther's Bible translation in its German European context.
Yeah.
Again, excellent article.
Yeah, well, and one of the benefits of the 2017 500th anniversary read is this flood of Luther scholarship, much of which, like the exhibition, is publicly accessible and is written for, I think, a broader audience than oftentimes scholars do. So thank you for those recommendations. And I just want to say thank you for this exhibition. It truly is a remarkable work of scholarship. And you're right, it's a team effort, and it draws on amazing collections that we're privileged to have. It draws on great expertise that we have in the library, but it does draw a little bit on that genius brain that you referred to earlier. So I don't think we could do it without that curatorial piece.
Luther's genius brain.
Well, you're in the vein of Luther, so we'll go with that. I want to thank everybody who's been with us today and everybody who's been participating in all of these conversations all fall. I do want to remind you that the exhibition will be physically open into December, and so you're welcome to come. but there is a virtual tour and there is a digital catalog that's available to you online. Otherwise, Armin, thank you so much for your work. Thank you for being such a great colleague and for participating in this conversation today. And I look forward to seeing everybody at our next Pitts Theology Library event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.